Okay, so the plan is we usually go over essays in class, and so I'm gonna kind of go over the essay topics here, which is basically knowing the battles and the significance of the battles, and then a few other things. And so I'm gonna go through battle by battle chronologically, and don't feel like you have to watch this entire thing all in one sitting for sure, but just in general, it's kind of long because there's a lot to go through. Feel free to skip around as you need to hear about different battles if you don't remember them. So I'm just going to put all the information out here, and however you use it to review is up to you. So, and I decided to type this instead of write it because some of you complain about my handwriting and whatever. All right, so key battles and their significance. So the first battle that we're going to talk about is Tarawa in November of 1943. So this is the first real test of storming a well-defended island. So Guadalcanal had happened in 1942 into 1943. However, Guadalcanal, the Japanese weren't ready for us, right? We kind of surprised them. So it's not like they had a well-defended beachhead. Remember at Tarawa, we messed up with the neap tide, and the result was hundreds of Marines die before they even make it to shore, right? Because the landing craft got hung up on the coral reef, and then the Marines had to bail out and go through hundreds of yards of water while getting raked by machine gun fire. Obviously, the Marines underestimated the Japanese resistance. So the report on the ship was like, we'll have this done in short order. In reality, it took several days. So this is a wake-up call. In the 76-hour battle of Tarawa, the U.S. Marines, sorry, just want to make sure. The U.S. Marines suffered almost as many killed in action casualties as U.S. troops suffered in the 6 months campaign at Guadalcanal. So I'm just trying to get everything down I'm saying here. So sorry. Apparently I talk faster than I type. Maybe I should get some of that fancy software. Or maybe I shouldn't be as so detailed. But it's kind of interesting, right? Because of the mishap with the tide and the coral reef and such, we just lost so many men. And Guadalcanal had been bad. We lost about 1,600 dead at Guadalcanal, and at Tarawa it was over 1,000, but in so much shorter time, and just kind of opened our eyes to how bad fighting the Japanese on these islands was going to be. It's probably best that we didn't know how bad Iwo Jima and Saipan and Okinawa were going to be before we started, because maybe we wouldn't have had the guts to finish. So we learned some important lessons from the Battle of Tarawa that would be applied to future atoll wars. So an atoll is just like a type of an island formed by coral. So things we learned: need for better reconnaissance, more precise and sustained pre-landing bombardment, like from naval vessels and planes, additional amphibious landing vehicles, and improved equipment. So we would develop different types of landing craft for different scenarios, including when there's reefs that were difficult to get over. We also needed better waterproofed radios. Okay, so that's Tarawa. I don't want Microsoft to be angry. Okay, so big idea there. We lost a lot of Marines in a short period of time. The island fighting was going to be terrible. We need to be better prepared, and fighting the Japanese was not going to be easy at all. Not that we thought it was going to be, but it was a lot harder than we imagined. All right, let's shift gears and go to the Italian front. Cassino in Anzio. That took place between January and May of 1944. So remember, we went up through Sicily into Italy, and then we ran into the Germans, who the Italians surrendered right away, and then the Germans came in because Hitler was going to give up Italy easily. And so we got stuck. One of the places we got stuck going north was at Monte Cassino. And remember the monastery is at the very top, this old monastery. And we thought the Germans were using it for our artillery, etc. And so we bombed it. But being stuck at this Gustav line, this major German defensive line going across the belt of Italy in the mountains. And so our solution to getting through the Gustav line was Anzio. So recall that in an attempt to get past the German defenses in the mountains of Italy on the Gustav line, we landed troops at Anzio. However, we picked the wrong general. Anzio was an amphibious landing that stalemated. So if you remember this, you can go back and check the video. We landed behind German lines, thinking we could break through to Rome or force them to interrupt their supplies to the Gustav line, but the general was really tentative and ended up just getting surrounded and bogged down even more. So this was this movement was part of the key objective to get to Rome. That was kind of the goal, retake Rome. So remember the Italian campaign, we started in Sicily, we go up the boot of Italy, we get held up at the Gustav line, some really terrible fighting, and our objective is to get to Rome, and that's what the Anzio Cassino battles, the intent was. However, the one positive, even though the fighting for Italy lasted so long, this forces Hitler to devote key troops and resources in Italy rather than on the Atlantic Wall, in France. So let's remember, D-Day was June 1944. So instead of putting all these resources in France to defend against a possible invasion, Hitler's got to devote all these resources in Italy. Okay, so speaking of D-Day, that's the next thing. So D-Day, remember this is a date you need to know, June 6, 1944. And so this is a massive invasion into France. So if you remember the situation here, the Russians are fighting the Germans basically alone, and Stalin's begging us to get involved. And so finally, after fighting in Africa and Italy, we team up with Britain, and we just send this massive armada to invade France by Normandy. And we used rubber tanks and stuff to fake the Germans out that were going by Calais, instead going by Normandy, with the 5 beaches and Pointe du Hoc and those things. Okay, so massive invasion. Oops. We attacked the Atlantic wall defenses of the Germans. Remember, Rommel wasn't there because he was back home with his wife for her birthday. The goal was to liberate Paris, and then to Belgium, and then on to Germany. And this opens, you know, some would call it a second front, or we can call it a third front, thinking we got, you know, we're fighting in Italy right now against the Germans. The Russians are fighting against the Germans in the east, and now we're fighting the Germans in France. And this is the really, you can call it the beginning of the end of the Germans. So remember, Churchill had that quote, I always get it wrong, but you know, after I think it was North Africa, he said this isn't the beginning of the end, but you could say it's the end of the beginning or something like that. But this is the beginning of the end for certainly we can say that for the Germans. Their Air Force, the Luftwaffe, is not a factor much. We have complete air supremacy, and now we're on a fast course towards the border of Germany. And then, yeah, so with that in mind, we cannot overstate the importance of this foothold, of this D-Day victory. And again, yeah, if you ever get a chance to go, because it's really sobering to be on those beaches and to see the German pillboxes that are there and to go to the cemetery. But so one of the most significant battles in our history, and certainly in World War II. Okay, so let's switch gears now. And what's happening almost simultaneously is in June of 1944, not only are we going after France, the Germans in France, but we're going after the Japanese in the Pacific with an armada that's roughly the same size, except this is the Marines and the Army too, but mainly the Marines. And we're going to Saipan in the Marianas. So the invasion fleet was similar to D-Day. Oops, D-Day. And if you recall from the videos, what happened before the invasion was the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. This decimates Jap planes and pilots, and maybe that's the bigger piece here. They just couldn't. They lost so many experienced pilots. Hundreds of Japanese planes shot down, and we lost hardly any. Just as a note, this is the first combat for African American troops who were transporting weapons and ammo and such, and came under attack by the Japanese. And from Saipan, well, you might be wondering, what was the significance of the Battle of Saipan? Why did we want it? Why did we take Saipan? Well, from Saipan, we can drop bombs on mainland Japan. That's so our brand new B-29 bomber could make it from the Marianas to mainland Japan. Remember, we hit Japan in the Doolittle raid, and we hadn't since. So this was a big deal. It also, remember, in this battle, it reveals the suicidal tendencies of the Japanese. So when it looked desperate and they weren't going to win, they did this Gyokasai. I don't know if I spelled that right. Probably not. Nope. Well, basically, it was these suicidal charges, bonsai charges, I guess. But remember, Gyokasai means shattering of the jewel. And not only did the soldiers do this, but they also convinced the civilians on Saipan to commit ritualistic suicide. So this is where the women, the fathers, they went out into the water, they drowned their kids and drowned themselves, or used grenades, or jumped off cliffs. Thousands of civilians who were basically like Japanese. This was the first, Saipan is like the first part of Japan that fell to the Americans. Yeah, so just horrific. And this is, you know, there's several Medal of Honor winners, the dentist, Ben Salomon, and Thomas Baker, and others. So you could remember those Medal of Honor winners. Apparently I still didn't spell suicide correctly. In fact, this was such a significant victory for the Americans that Hideki Tojo, who was the military leader for Japan, who kind of was prominent in the Pearl Harbor attack, he resigned because he had promised the United States would never take Saipan. Also, as I mentioned, so I'll just jot that down here, that Saipan is the first part in the Pacific, first part of Japan that fell to the Americans. So thinking about why it was significant. So 3,000 Americans were killed in action in Saipan, which is the most so far in the battle for the Pacific. All right, let's talk about another maybe less well-known battle, and that's Peleliu, September of 1944. So we had fought several battles against the Japanese, Guadalcanal, New Britain, Saipan, and in each of these cases, the Japanese, we change, Tarawa, we change, but so the Japanese. So the Japanese have a new strategy, really, that they employ on Peleliu. And if you remember from the E.B. Sledge reading, this idea he argued about interconnecting fields of fire. So you set up your artillery and your machine guns so that no matter where the Americans were, the Japanese could reach out and touch them and just decimate them. And just how horrific the fighting was on Peleliu, right? So the Japanese turned Peleliu into a rocky fortress. And if you remember, yeah, Ermerbrogel Mountain was the name of the most defensible position on Peleliu. And the Battle of Peleliu has the terrible distinction and resulting in the highest casualty rate. I'm going to problem spelling. Of any amphibious assault in American military history. So the approximately 28,000, now you don't have to know all this detail, but I'm just kind of giving it to you. Of the 28,000 Marines and infantry troops involved, a full 40% of the Marines died or were wounded. So, yeah, but 1,800 KIA. So that's a terrible high cost for this small island. So, yeah, and that was because of their maybe overconfidence, like we pounded the island with the Navy, and that might not have done near as much damage as we thought. We didn't really understand Palalu's unique terrain or how the Japanese were going to use the terrain to defend. Maybe a bit of overconfidence by the Marines, who could have used more support. Hard to say. So why was Peleliu important as far as the war effort? Well, it helped MacArthur in his plan to recapture the Philippines. That was the big reason for taking it. And we also learned many valuable lessons. So, like how the Japanese were fighting this war of attrition, with, you know, where they're defending what they can defend and then cause maximum damage. And obviously the Japanese are going to use this at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, right? So they're learning too. So we're learning valuable lessons about how to fight them. They're learning valuable lessons about how to fight us. All right, let's switch back to Europe. And so meanwhile, as the Marines are trying to take Peleliu halfway across the world, was the Battle of Market Garden. And so if you recall, this was a massive glider, paratrooper invasion of the Netherlands that was still occupied by Germany. And remember, this was the, you know, the Bernard Montgomery plan. And we looked at the bridge too far. You read part of that. And you learned about how, yeah, we made all kinds of mistakes. We had communication problems. For the ambitiousness of the plan, it was not planned well enough to execute that. Then we looked at John Frost, who was the hero who tried to hold that bridge at Arnhem, ultimately failed, but heroically made his stand there. And the result really is this extends the war. Instead of using the resources to invade the Netherlands, if we had done that going after Belgium and Germany, maybe we shorten the war. Or if we had executed this plan better or planned more efficiently. So the war is going to be lengthened because of this failure. Right. Then we'll shift back to the Pacific and Leyte Gulf. October 1944. So we spent quite a bit of time on this battle. It's the largest naval battle in world history. Remember, the Japanese had 3 task forces to the north. So the first one went to the south, and that one was taken care of by the American Navy. And then they had another one to the north that was just bait. And General Halsey, thinking this was the great prize of the Pacific, took the bait, and so that left the American transports vulnerable. So they were completely unprotected. And so the American small boats, this would be destroyers, destroyer escorts, and jeeps, the CVEs, have to attack a much larger and more powerful Japanese center force, consisting of like the Yamato, which was the biggest battleship ever built. Remember the guns of the Yamato weighed more than our little destroyer and destroyer escorts that were fighting against them, and their armor. Remember, so you've seen the video how thick the armor was. Just trying to fit this here. And that, yeah, our ship's guns couldn't even penetrate the Yamato armor. So we have these little pea shooters. I mean, and the distance, right? The Yamato can fire over 20 miles, and we can't. So our ships have to zoom way in close to try to do anything. And yeah, it's David versus Goliath here. And so we fight heroically, and many sailors give up their lives and their ships. Oops. To save the transports and protect the invasion of the Philippines. Right, so the Japanese Navy is severely crippled. So despite the success of the center force, the Japanese center force, they retreated. They didn't realize how significant advantage they had, and the fury of our little boat attack was such that it drove the center force back. And so the other two task forces that the Japanese sent in were severely destroyed, really, by the Americans, and so their navy's basically done. So the Air Force is ripped up at the Turkey Shoot. Now their navy's ripped up at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and so really they're left with basically nothing to fight the rest of the war. So they cannot stop the future invasion of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And it's the first use of kamikazes by the Japanese, and they just sink at least one of our CVEs, our escort carriers, with, I think it was a St. Lo, with kamikazes. All right, let's move on back to Europe. So just trying to cover this chronologically. The Battle of the Bulge. So this is December 1944 through January of 1945. Now recall, yeah, some people thought we'd be home by Christmas in 44, but the failure of Market Garden and the resurgence of the Nazis, who refused to give up, made us extend the war into 1945. So the Battle of the Bulge was the last major offensive from the Nazis. Remember from like the video that that Otto Skorzeny, can't remember his name. He's the one who freed Mussolini, but then him and his fellow SS men, they get U.S. uniforms and in vehicles and dress up like the U.S. soldiers and infiltrate our guys and behind our lines. And then they the Germans time the attack, so there's bad weather, so our planes can't operate to drop bombs, etc., on the German tanks. It's freezing cold weather. You saw that from the videos, just temperatures below freezing. Men get trench foot, so you saw some video of that. As far as the terror of the battle, non-combat injuries. Then you had Bastogne, which was surrounded by the Germans. The 101st Airborne held out. That was a significant part of the battle. And then looking more big picture, the Germans exhaust their fuel, and so Hitler thought in his crazy mind that they could get enough into the Allied territory to grab the Allied fuel supplies and continue fighting. But of course, they didn't make it. So I call this Hitler's last crazy gasp to stop the Allied advance. So just putting that down, he thought he could force us to give up or sue for peace. He thought he was going to just, he, to his credit, he understood that there was a weakness in our line. We had advanced too far. We weren't, our positions weren't that defensible. They attack, and that's why it's called the Battle of the Bulge, right? It creates this huge bulge in Allied lines, and he thought he could just punch through and get all the way to our supplies and grab our supplies and keep fighting and force us to sue for peace, which of course was crazy, but that was crazy. 19,000 Americans are killed in the Battle of the Bulge. So largest of any battle in World War II. So there's, the last major battle on the Western Front. So just how important the Battle of the Bulge was to basically end any chance Hitler had of victory and to ensure our victory. And from there on, I mean, Hitler just didn't have the resources to fend off the Russians and the Americans and the British. And by April, we were into Germany. Okay, so let's shift from Europe back to the war in the Pacific. So important battle number 9, and that's the Battle of Manila in the Philippines. And that was from February to March of 1945. So reasons why this was important: it was kind of the culminating battle of the liberation of the Philippines, and one of the key things that we did was save the survivors of the Bataan Death March. So they were in concentration camps, wasting away. Many of them had been killed by the Japanese, murdered, tortured, burned with aviation fuel. And so we owed it to them. We had left them there to go back and save them. And remember, Douglas MacArthur wants to liberate his hometown. He basically grew up in Manila, and he had a special love for the Filipino people. So that was another reason. Remember, there was some argument about whether the Philippines never needed to be invaded. And obviously by doing this, we lost American lives, but we owed a debt to these survivors. And, the Japanese killed 100,000 Filipino people just in our attempt to liberate because of their cruelty. So remember in the content video, we looked at how the Japanese wouldn't surrender, even though they were commanded to. Sanji Iwabushi, the commander on the ground there, to try to save his honor from past failures, decided to hold the city of Manila, specifically the Intramuros, the citadel in the middle, at all cost, and burn part of the town and burn bridges and street by street fighting. But the big idea there is the significance of saving the survivors from the death march and liberating the Philippines. And then remember, we would give them their independence the following year, July 4, 1946, I believe. We gave the Philippines their independence. All right, now let's talk about Iwo Jima. February 19, remember I said that's a date you need to know, to March 26 of 1945. So about the same time the battle for Manila is going on, we're fighting for Iwo Jima. So one of the peculiarities here, it's the only battle in the Pacific where U.S. Marine casualties are higher than the Japanese. Now remember, key point, casualties is dead and wounded. So we had like 25,000 or so casualties at Iwo Jima, and the Japanese had like 22,000, but almost all of them were dead, killed in action. We lost less than 10,000 killed in action. Significance obviously is Mount Suribachi and the flag raising there, the two flag raisings. But then if you think about this, the flag raisers like Ira Hayes, and how this would change his life, PTSD, and eventually dies very young because of alcoholism. And then the bond tour, how this picture that Joe Rosenthal took of the flag raising, now it's the Marine Monument in Washington, D.C., and then these Ira Hayes and Bradley and Gagnon all came home and they did the bond tour and they raised $26 billion for the war. So that's of significance as well. And I had you do that Moodle thing quiz where you looked at the different ways that Kirabayashi built his defenses on Iwo Jima. That goes from the spider holes, the 11 plus miles of tunnels through Mount Suribachi and the island, cave networks, hospitals, mess halls, etc. Everything was underground, and the bunkers and such were built to withstand heavy shells from ships and bombs from planes. And then how every Japanese soldier knew he was going to die there, and they basically were trying to kill 10 Americans for every one Japanese. The reasons we wanted Iwo Jima: we needed airfields for our damaged B-29s coming back from bombing runs. Remember, we're launching them from Tinian and Saipan, Guam, from the Mariana Islands. But then if they were hit by flak or fighters and couldn't make it all the way back, because it was a very long flight, like 18 hours or something like that, round trip. So then they could land back in Iwo Jima. And we saved, arguably, more men from these B-29s, et cetera, that landed on Iwo Jima than we lost taking the island. So this became a P-51 fighter escort base because of the airfields on Iwo Jima, right? That's part of the reason we wanted it, so we could have our P-51 fighters. So when our bombers were launched from the Marianas, then these P-51s could join them, fly to the rest of the way to Japan, and then to protect our bombers from Japanese fighters, etc. And then the P-51s could land back on Iwo Jima as the B-29s went back to Saipan. And the Japs had their early warning radar here. So we wanted to take that out, so that mainland Japan didn't know we were coming. And if we tried to skirt around, we ran out of fuel. It's just so. Okay, so that's Iwo Jima, and so know those reasons why Iwo Jima. Remember, the Marine Corps considers it one of their greatest victories just because of how well it was defended by the Japanese. And uncommon valor was a common virtue. All right. Okinawa. So this is the worst battle in the Pacific for the U.S. And in part because we had 12,000 plus Americans killed in action. Kamikazes, remember that means divine wind. Kamikazes kill, and the Oka, right? Kill almost 5,000 sailors. That's part of that 12,000 number. And the Japanese, part of the reason they were so effective here, remember 80,000 Japanese, 20,000 Okinawan conscripts against 250,000 Americans. The Japanese only defend the most defensible regions of the island. So remember, we wanted Okinawa because we wanted a base with which to prepare our invasion of Japan. That's why we wanted Okinawa. So defenses, they had like the Shuri Line, Wana Ridge, Wana Draw, etc. And yeah, so when we first hit the island, there was no resistance. And it wasn't until we got towards the part of the island with the most defensible rocky crags and caves and such that the Japanese had their artillery and machine guns and just decimated our men. Well, the battle lasted for almost 3 months. You know, Iwo Jima lasted for a month. So, yeah, we were terrorized on Okinawa. The Okinawan people are forced to help as soldiers and nurses. Oops, come on, go away, go away. Civilians are told to commit suicide. Used as human shields. You remember that from the different videos. And then this battle, along with Iwo Jima, and just the war in general, obviously, but this battle in particular, convinced Truman that the atomic bomb is a legitimate military, legitimate military option, as his military advisors estimate 1 million casualties. To invade Japan. Plus, it would take at least a year, estimate. So, Truman's looking at the battle reports and how horrified you saw some of the footage of the kamikazes hitting like the USS Bunker Hill, listening to men talk about what it was like to fight there, and literally going cave by cave, and just how terrible the Japanese weaponry was. They weren't doing the banzai charges anymore like they had done earlier in the war. They were, and we were looking at invading mainland Japan, and yeah, I mean, if it took us 3 months and 12,000 killed to take a small island, what would it take for the mainland of Japan itself? All right, so that's the last of the battles. Let's move on to other key topics. One, the firebombing of Japan. All right, so some of the things, maybe you remember this from the content video. The firebombing of Japan kills more Japanese than the atomic bombs. So this started March 9, 1945, under the command of Curtis Zoe LeMay. So he has this idea of using incendiary bombs of napalm to start fires in Tokyo first, because their buildings are made out of a lot of wood and very flammable products. And this creates a firestorm under some ideal conditions and just decimates the city and kills thousands. And the significance of this is it really destroys the, let's say, destroys Japan's ability to fight the war. But they don't surrender. So by the time we dropped the first atomic bomb in August, we had been firebombing them for months, and they didn't surrender. So instead of dropping normal bombs from high distances, we came in very low to drop these bombs. So that's another significant topic. Then let's shift into the atomic bombs. So the Manhattan Project. So this started back in the late 30s. So it starts with Einstein's letter to FDR. This is just a little background. This is all in the video. And it's really Jews, German Jews. So there was Szilard, Fermi. So Fermi wasn't a Jew, but he was married to one. And then Einstein, and then Oppenheimer. So these physicists, their desire was to beat the Germans to this technology. And they never were thinking about using this bomb against Japan. It was really to get the bomb before the Germans did, and then use it against the Germans, maybe as a revenge because of the Holocaust. So we built these secret plants. So this is just kind of more info. Oak Ridge, Hanford in Washington. Oak Ridge is in Tennessee. And then Los Alamos in New Mexico. And so these were like small cities, right, that we used to refine uranium and plutonium for the bombs. So first atomic bomb, Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. Scroll down here. And that killed maybe 100,000 or more people. And that, remember, that happened 11 days after the Potsdam Declaration, where we warned Japan to surrender or else. And they did not. And so then 3 days later, we dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. And meanwhile, the Russians declare war, breaking their 5-year anti-aggression pact, non-aggression pact with the Japanese, and invade Manchuria. So let's think about reasons why here. Little allusion to Tennyson's poem there. Sure. So remember, President Truman said the reason he was going to drop the bomb was to save American lives. You know, looking back, we had already lost over 400,000 men in the war. Estimates were 1 million casualties to invade mainland Japan. We just came out of the Battle of Okinawa, where we had over 12,000 killed. And so Truman said, you know, to use the bomb to end the war to save American lives. Number two, the Japanese refusal to surrender. So all through the battles that we fought, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Saipan, etc., we see this intense refusal to surrender of the Japanese, this kind of corrupted Bushido code that they're going to fight to the end. And this was another reason, like, that intimidated us, that we didn't want to invade Japan, to face this type of fanatical spirit. Another factor was the Japanese brutality and cruelty. So in the video, when I talk about dropping the atomic bomb, we went through all the different examples of Japanese brutality and cruelty, starting with the rape of Nanking, all the way up into Okinawa, and the different things the Japanese did. And that really jaded us to Japanese suffering. Like, you know, 75 years later, we don't understand what it would have been like for an American military person who had experienced the terror of the Japanese and their view of the Japanese versus ours today. So in that moment, in that mentality, they wanted revenge. Another thing we mentioned in the video is to prevent the Russians from claiming part of Japan. And kind of coupled with that is the idea that communism is worse than an atomic bomb. So we saw what Stalin was doing. We even though we were allies with Stalin against the Germans, we were really no friend of the Russians. Churchill, well, Patton, reading some of your book reviews, Patton wanted to go right into Russia after World War II because of Stalin and the communists. And if you remember world history, looking at the things that the Russians had done in the Ukraine, right? The Holodomor, the forced starvation, the millions that Stalin killed. We did not want Stalin in Japan. Stalin would take half of Korea, which would lead us to the Korean War. Can you imagine if Japan, which is one of the greatest economies in the world today, had been forced into communism? So we dropped the bomb to intimidate the Russians, or to at least stop the war before the Russians can force claim on part of Japan if they were part of the invasion. And then, the invasion of Japan, had it happened, if it was going to happen, would have been many more times terrible than the bombs. So the argument here is that if we had gone through with Operation Downfall and spent over a year subduing the Japanese against, millions of civilians and troops who would fight to the death or commit suicide, many, many more Japanese would have died, and the destruction to their cities would have been even worse than the bombs, which brought a quick end to the war, coupled with the Russian entrance into the war against the Japanese. Then the thing at the last piece here was, looking back at the video, was this justifiable and biblical? And I really stammered and had a hard time with this, and I still do. I was not there with the advisors who met with Truman to discuss, should we drop this bomb? And if I had been, and if I had been a chief military advisor and had seen all the things that I had, throughout the World War II, how jaded would I have been against the Japanese? I don't know. I have a hard time with this because of the intentional murdering, killing of women and children and old people, and I just wonder if there wasn't another way that we could have used the bomb to push Japan towards surrender, but not endanger so many lives. And yeah, at that, our like I said, our minds work a lot differently in some regard, but the truth of the Bible is forever. And maybe I don't know all the details, but I would have had a hard time dropping the bombs the way they did, especially the second one against Nagasaki. Yes, it was partially a military target. We destroyed the Mitsubishi company that was producing war materials, and there were thousands of troops there, just like there were thousands of troops at Hiroshima. But the snuffing out of the lives of children, etc., it purposefully. It's one thing if children and women are killed in the battle, like at Okinawa, when the Americans accidentally fired on some of them, or you drop bombs and you're intending to hit military targets and you kill women and children without knowing it. That's different than dropping an atomic bomb knowing you are going to kill women and children. So those are just my thoughts. I wish we were in class, we could discuss it, because I'm sure you would have many great points and ideas. Okay, let's look at one more topic here. Nazi U-boats and the Enigma. So this goes back a ways towards the beginning of the unit. So we looked at the Hitler's usage of U-boats, and we kind of saw that Hitler maybe doesn't learn from World War I enough to heavily invest in U-boats. So at the beginning of the war, Germany had less than 50. I think 26 was the number, and so he builds this, massive battleship, the Bismarck, but World War II was not a battleship-dominated war. It was aircraft carriers and U-boats. So that's one point. If Hitler had invested in U-boats. Does this change the war against Britain? So could the war against Britain be won with more U-boats? So remember, before we entered the war, 1941, we were sending all these war supplies to Britain. What if the subs were sinking so many more ships? Would the British have surrendered, or would the British have been more easily conquered, or could they have been conquered by Germany had there been more U-boats? Maybe I should put Britain in here instead of just, sorry, I'm thinking and typing. It's easier to write on a whiteboard. Thirdly, switching gears here. So the U-boats were extremely important, and you can go back to the video and look at the statistics and things, how many ships they sunk, and especially the early part of the war. And then look at the Enigma part. So the Nazi Enigma was their code machine. And even in the very beginning of the war, the Allies were already trying to crack the code to the Enigma. So the Enigma was this machine. You can go back and look at it in the video. And the Germans used it to send their coded messages. And then starting with Marian Majewski, the Pole, they start to crack the code, invent machines to help them break the code. The British, remember, at Bletchley Park, had Alan Turing, who was this genius, to help decipher. And then when the Germans upgraded the Enigma, then they were able to disable the U-boat 559 in the Mediterranean, I believe. And then 3 British sailors, Tony Fasten, Colin Grazier, and Tommy Brown, did that daring mission where they swam to the disabled U-boat that was sinking, and they went in and they got the updated plans, etc., to the Enigma, and Brown alone escaped alive. But experts suggest that thousands of lives were saved because of the efforts to decipher these codes. And all these messages, thousands and thousands and thousands of messages as to where the U-boats were and Hitler's plans and all these things, we gained from this technology, this espionage, cryptology stuff. So huge impact on the war. Behind the scenes, the cryptologists deciphering these German codes. Okay, again, just go back to the videos if you need to skip through them a little bit to get an idea. And I'll remember to post the PowerPoint in some way so you can look through that. All right, we got to talk about the Holocaust. You watched a video today on it, and I'll put more things up and talk about it more tomorrow, so we'll come back to that one. And then the last one is segregation and racism and American hypocrisy, looking at several topics. So the Tuskegee Airmen, remember Shelby Westbrook, and black pilots who then are treated like Shelby was after he came home. He's a war hero, but can't get a job because he's black. The Navajo code talkers, we haven't mentioned them yet, but I'll do that in a separate video. The Japanese internment, we looked a little bit at that in a video with Jimmy Tanaka, can't remember his last name, from the 442nd. His parents are interned, forced into these, basically like a prison, and then he's off fighting the Germans and gets captured, and so we'll talk more about that. And the Port Chicago incident, which we haven't mentioned yet at all, but I will. And the Detroit riot of 1943, again, haven't talked about it yet. So the Holocaust topics 4 and 5 we'll get to tomorrow, and that will contribute here. So this concludes the test review. So if you have other specific questions, you can go back to the videos, or you can email me in preparation for the test.